when we were going through it, and I remember now that I failed you in a certain respect. I failed to give a little bit of clarity about these practices. Because here's the thing, and I know this because I've talked with you guys. I mean, we've been sharing this in small group. Trying to do these things is tough. And it seems laborious. It seems difficult. It seems painstaking when the pastor talks about fasting and prayer and meditation, and we've been pounding them out each week and not even spending a whole lot of time really unpacking them in detail. We will unpack them at the retreat. If you can join, that'd be great. But here's the thing. It's very easy to get caught up in these practices and be brought down by them. To think, I need to pray more. Okay, now he's telling me I have to fast. Now he's telling me I have to meditate. Again. And it gets tiring. But here's the thing. Throughout the entire lifespan of the Christian community, these practices were not meant as a burden. They were meant instead for freedom. They were meant that if you practiced them, you would start to feel freedom in your life, unlike you felt in any other way before. And you see, here's the thing. You say, well, how does fasting lead to freedom? Well, if you're able to fast, you may think it's a burden, but it'll teach you and it will help you be free from the thing that you're fasting from. The best illustration that I can give is if you want to run a 20-mile, if you want to be free to run 20 miles, you want to be free to run a 20-mile marathon, you need to practice. See, the practice leads to the freedom. There's a famous quote from the great orator Demosthenes, and he said, he was a legendary orator in ancient Greece, and he said, I'm only free. Everybody asked him, what's your secret? And he said, I'm only free to communicate as well as I do because I've practiced it. And then, of course, they say, well, how did you practice it? And he was a weird guy. He had a weird practicing method. He would go down to the ocean where it was loudest, the ocean side, and he would put pebbles in his mouth, I kid you not, and he would practice, he would talk, he would try to orate, and he figured if he could practice like that, then he could speak anywhere. But he says, listen, I'm only free to do that, to be this great orator, because I've practiced. And I wanted to take a moment this morning to say that these practices are meant for freedom. They're not meant to burden you down. And I hope that by grace and by the power of the gospel, you've put some of these into effect. And that by that grace and gospel, you've been able to see the freedom that you get from it. Now, today we look at one that by its very definition, by its very word, sounds like the exact opposite of freedom. Submission. It's the Christian practice of submission. And even just saying that, isn't that a little scary of a word? Just saying it out loud, submission. And I know you're thinking, oh no, what is he going to ask me to do today? What do I have to submit to today and bow to today? What I want to show you today is that the Christian practice of submission is unlike anything you may have defined as submission before. See, in submission, and this is interesting because this group is very multicultural, and depending upon which culture you come from, submitting either to God or to other people, depending upon what culture you come out of, submission can either be greatly easy but also greatly manipulated, or it can be greatly difficult and then greatly avoided. Let me explain what I mean. If you come up from a more traditional culture, submission to your parents, submission to the institutions, submission to the church, submission to anything will come rapidly easy to you. But it'll also be manipulated in a way to control you. You'll submit, but with resentment. And some of you know what I'm talking about because you've been doing this your entire life. Submission comes greatly easy to you, but it comes with a price. But if you're like me, if you come from a more contemporary, or you want to call it a more Western culture, submission is incredibly difficult to do. I avoid it. We believe that we're the individual. Why should we submit to others? See, culturally speaking, submission is either going to be easy for you, but come with a price tag, or it's going to be difficult for you and you're going to avoid it at all cost. But the Christian definition of submission, what Jesus talks about here today, is not like any of those. Let me give a quick example, and this comes from Colossians 3, and then I'll get into the meat of this message. And let me explain what I mean by how it goes, submission in the Christian world goes against both of those cultural norms. In Colossians 3, if you go back to it, starting at 18, you can look at this a little bit later. I didn't put it in your outline or on the screen. Paul has this famous passage where he says, submit. And he says, slaves, submit to your masters. And he says, wives, submit to your husbands. And it's all about submission. Now, what's easy to think about there is those people were already in subordinate roles. They were already in submissive roles. And yet Paul looks at them and says, culturally speaking, it's easy for you to submit because you're forced to submit. But he says, I want you to submit in your heart. And then he goes on the next couple of verses, and he says, husbands, love your wives and honor them. And he goes on, and parents, honor your children. Now you see what he's doing here? He's flipping it. At first, the people who were in subordinate roles, he says, yes, you're forced to submit, but I want you to do it in your heart. The people who are in superordinate roles, he says, I also want you to submit. See what it does? He grates against both cultural norms. He says the Christian idea of submission will challenge where your culture comes out of. Let's look at this today. I want to look at it in a couple different ways. And I try to make it a little punchy for you and do the little word plays here. So I want to look at it under three ways. First, what submission is not, what it is, and how you get to start doing it. And how you get the freedom when you start to submit to God and to others. First, we see what it is not in Peter's plan. I know, Peter's plan. Say that 5 times fast. We see what it is not. What Christian submission is not is in Peter's plan and the Peter that's in all of us. Secondly, we see what submission is in the Savior's sacrifice. And lastly, we see how it's possible by the gift of the gospel. Peter's plan, the Savior's sacrifice, the gift of the gospel. Let me just explain what I mean. First, Peter. If you look back, if you have a Bible, please do look back at this. The text is not going to be on the screen for you, so you really need to look at this narrative. I want to pull it apart just a little bit for you to show you something very subversive that's going on and very anti-submission. First, Peter. If you look in verse 27 to 29, there's this interchange between Peter and Jesus. And Jesus says to Peter, who do people say I am? And he says, they think you're John or Elijah or some prophet. And what they're basically translating that into modern parlance, what they're saying is, everybody thinks you're a really cool guy. And you've got a lot of talent. And they like you and they want to listen to you. And then Jesus needles Peter. Jesus needles people a lot. He sticks it in a little bit more and he says, but Peter, who do you say I am? To his disciples, who do you say I am? And Peter stands up and he says, you are the Christ. Now, I want that to sink in for you this morning. The weight of what Peter is saying right now. This word is Christos or anointed. It's the anointed one. It's the one everybody's been waiting for. Peter, a little Jewish boy, would have sat on his father's lap growing up, and he would have heard the stories of this anointed one that's going to come, and he's going to fix suffering and pain and loss, and he's going to heal the world, and he's going to free everybody. He's going to free us, and Peter would have grown up with these stories. This is the one, and Peter's looking right at Jesus, and he says, you're it. You're the one we've always been waiting for our whole life. This is one of the boldest proclamations you could ever make. He says, finally, you're here. But in verse 32, Peter does something very odd. He takes Jesus aside and says, Jesus, psst, psst, come here. Jesus, come here. And it says he begins to rebuke him, and I know that's a strange word for some of you. That word in Greek actually translates to the way in which you would talk to a child who was misbehaving. He scolds Jesus. You see what's happening here? On one moment, he says, you're it. You're the man. You're the one we've always been waiting for. You're going to liberate us now. You're going to free us. You're going to set us free. And then probably not even 30, 45 minutes later, he scolds him like a little child. Why? I gave you the 2 pieces of the breast outside of the sandwich. What's in the middle of the sandwich? It's when Jesus says, I must suffer and die. See, Peter had a plan. He thought they were going to ride into Jerusalem, set everybody free, kick those mean Romans out. And Peter surely knew that he was going to have a right-hand seat to the throne. Peter had a 5-year plan. He did. He had a 5-year plan, and it involved Jesus going into Jerusalem and taking it over and putting Peter in a place of power. And all the other disciples, they were going to be the ones in charge now. They're not going to be kicked around anymore like they've been their whole lives. They're not going to be poor anymore like they've been their whole lives. They're not going to be disgraced like they've been their whole lives. They've been out in the wilderness, they've been following this guy, and finally the moment's here, Peter says. And Jesus looks at him and says, not a chance. See what Jesus does? He looks at Peter and he says, he actually does say it in the end. He says, Peter, don't you get it? Your plans are all about you, not about me. You have a 5-year plan that has nothing to do with the pattern in which way I'm working in my life. See, Peter's plan, all of us, we all have the Peter inside of us. We have our 5-year plans, do we not? And the minute that God doesn't own up to it, or the minute that other people don't own up to us, or don't bend to our will, or don't bend to our agenda, we react the same way Peter did. Do we not? Scolding, chiding, rebuking. What makes Christian submitting to others? See, in this story, Jesus says, Peter, you have to submit to me. I know you think you know the way it's going to work, but it's not going to work that way. And that kills Peter. He can't stand it. The very one that he calls Christ, in a couple minutes, he starts chastising and scolding and saying, you've got it all wrong. Why? Because Jesus will have nothing to do with Peter's plan. He says, ultimately, Peter, you have the inability to submit to me. You want everybody to bend to you, to go along with your agenda, your will. You think you know the way it's going to work, and the minute that it starts to go the other way, starts to go south, you run, you scold. And if we're honest with ourselves, this is the way we are. This is what makes submitting to other people, and definitely submitting to God, incredibly difficult, because deep down inside, we're Peter and we have a plan. We know the way things ought to work. We know the way things are going to pan out. And when others don't fall in line with that, we say, forget them. And God doesn't fall in line with it. We say, what's your problem? We scold. That's what Christian submission is not. It's when you say, my will be done, not thine. But Christian submission is seen in what Jesus says here. And let me explain this. Jesus says, if you want to follow me, you're going to have to take up your cross, meaning you're going to have to bend to me. You're going to have to bend to others. You're going to have to submit to people in your life that is going to be uncomfortable and painful for you to do. But you're going to have to do it. You're going to have to give in to their will and their needs and meet their needs before you meet yours. In verse 34 and 35, Jesus says something very radical. He's just been called the King of all kings. He's just been called the Anointed One. And then he says, but he must suffer and die. And he says, if you want to follow me, you got to take up your cross. Pause for a moment. Let me explain how radical this is. He says, the Messiah, Peter calls him. And at the time that Jesus was alive, there were a lot of Messiahs, believe it or not. I know in the church we use that word Messiah a lot. But at this time, there were a lot of other Messiahs. There were a lot of other men, mainly men, almost all men. I can't think of one of them being a woman, but there was a long list of these men who stood up in the time that Jesus was alive and said, I'm the Messiah. Follow me. And they would get a little following for a while, and then most of them were somehow killed off, and their followers were scattered. But here's the difference between those Messiahs and this Messiah. Those Messiahs tried to get power. Jesus says, I'm going to give up power. Those Messiahs, everybody who stood up at that time, sought the throne. Jesus says, I seek the cross. Do you see what Christian submission is? It's when Jesus says, take up your cross, and then you'll find freedom. He looks at you and me, and he says, if you're going to have to submit to others to find the freedom that you want in your life. You're going to have to follow me. And Jesus says, I'm the king. Yes, I'm the king of all kings. I'm the king to end all kings. But I'm going to a cross, not a throne. I'm going to death, not earthly exaltation. At this time, kings didn't do that. If you were a king, you made decrees and proclamations. You made people bow before you. And Jesus says, I'm a king, but not like any other king you're ever going to know. I'm the only king that loses power to get power. I'm the only king that submits to get freedom. And he says, in your life, you're going to have to do the same thing. There was a great hymn by George Matheson. I think I put it in your inside of your bulletin. Hopefully I put it in your outline. Make me a captive, Lord, and then I shall be free. Force me to render up my sword, and I shall conqueror be. I sink in life's alarms when by myself I stand. Imprison me within thine arms, and strong shall be my hand. Jesus says, you spend your whole life running around trying to get everybody to be a captive to you, to submit to you. But if you want true freedom, you are going to have to start to learn how to submit to others and to submit to God. So he says, take up your cross. And it's the most countercultural, radically almost stupid thing for him to say at the time. He's a king with a cross. Other kings were robed and clothed and crowned. He was stripped and beaten and torn. His kingship was unlike any other kingship because it was a kingship of submission. Now, it's about 12 o'clock. We can stop now. But that wouldn't be fair. Because if I left you leaving the room with that on your mind and heart, you would say, I can't do that. I know what the pastor said, that he gave up his life and he went to the cross, and that sounds great and that's good submission, but that doesn't work for me. That's too much. It's too much of a burden. And I 100% agree with you. Willpower alone will never do it for you. You need to be changed from the inside. You need to see submission as beautifully done for you before you will ever consider doing it for others. And here's where it comes. There's another part where Jesus gives a definition of submission, and it comes in Luke 22, and he's in the garden, and he's praying. And it's the moment when he knows for sure that he's going to go die. He knows it. He's seeing it. Commentators say he feels the power of the death grip on him already. And he's crying, and he's pleading, and he says, please, Lord, if there's another way. But he pauses. And he says, not my will be done, but thine. See, the gospel says, you and me live like Peters. When things don't go the way we want, when people don't bend to our agenda, when God doesn't bend to our agenda, we scold, we chastise, we get angry. But the gospel says in all of that self-centeredness, Jesus came. And he had every right to say, my will be done, not theirs. But he looks to the Lord in heaven, who he knows he's going to die soon. And he says, I'll take this. I'll submit so that they can be saved. This is the most beautiful picture of submission that you'll ever get. You and I cannot do this on our own. We need to see the one who submitted for us. Jesus is a great model when he says, take up your cross, but it's an even greater power when you start to pray this through and you start to see him in the garden. You start to hear him say, I know I'm going to die. I know it's going to be painful and I'm going to lose my father, but I will do it for them. And I'll do it for you, he says. When that starts to get into the bottom of your heart, that's grace. Only when you see that as beautiful, only when you see him as beautiful, will you ever want to submit to others. Let me tell a story to close, to explain what I mean by seeing him as beautiful and what it does to you. There's one of the stories of the Chronicles of Narnia that I like, and it's not really talked about that much. It's called The Horse and His Boy. And I like this one because it is the model of what beautiful submission could look like, which, that if you see the gospel as truly beautiful, what it's going to do to you from the inside out and how it's going to shake you down. Here's the story, here's the summary of it. There's a little boy named Shasta, and he's got a big stallion of a horse named Bree. Bree is an older horse, a stallion, strong, good-looking, and Bree can talk. Because animals, in Chronicles of Narnia, of course, they can talk. And Bree can talk, and one day he talks to Shasta, and he says, Shasta, let's leave here, let's go on a journey, let's get away from here, for a variety of reasons. And so Shasta's a little shocked at the talking horse, but of course he goes with him. And along the way, they meet two other people, Aravis, a girl, and Hwin, a smaller, younger horse. And Hwin can talk as well, because again, it's Narnia, horses can talk. And so they go through the journey together, and all throughout the story, Bree is almost pompous. Bree knows, Bree is a know-it-all. Bree knows, he says, we got to go this way, not that way. And Hwin, the little baby horse, says, no, we got to go this way to get away from danger. And Bree says, oh, you're young, you don't know what you're talking about. And then there's a part in the story where Bree, he's from Narnia, and he always says, in the great name and by the great mane, which he's referring to Aslan, the lion character. And at one point, Hwin says, who is this great mane and great name that you're talking about? And Bree says, well, it's the Lion King. It's the king of all kings. But there's a problem. Hwin looks at Bree and says, is it really true? Is this a lion? And is he true? And is he going to do everything that you believe he will? And Bree says, he's not really a lion. If he was a lion, then he would just be a beast like us. He's not a lion, it's just a legend. See, Bree knows something in his head, but it hasn't gotten down to his heart yet. And throughout the whole story, Bree he condescends to pretty much everybody. He's talking down to Aravis, he's talking down to Shasta, he's talking down to Hwin, the other horse, and he knows the way, he's got a plan, and he knows the way to go. And he says, we got to go this way, we got to go this way. And there's a part in there where Aslan shows up. And if you know the movies, it's always the coolest part when Aslan shows up. Here's what happens. Let me read this for you. Bree is looking at them and standing and looking at them. His back's to the wall. And they're arguing again about the lion. And Bree just says, you don't know what you're talking about. Trust me. I'm older. I'm wiser. I know. He's a know-it-all. He says, well, you'd hardly understand that at your age, Bree says. Bree was standing with his back to the green wall while he said this. And the other two were facing him. He was talking in a rather superior tone with his eyes half shut. That is why he didn't see the changed expressions on the faces of Hwin and Avarice. They had good reason to have open mouths and staring eyes. Because while Bree spoke, they saw an enormous lion leap up from outside and balance itself on top of the green wall. Only it was a brighter yellow, and it was bigger and more beautiful and more alarming than any lion they had ever seen. And at once it jumped down inside the wall and began approaching Bree from behind. It made no noise at all, and Hwin and Aravis couldn't make any noise themselves, no more as if they were frozen. And this is where it gets cool. Bree says, he would have whiskers. He couldn't be real. And for just as he said the word whiskers, one of Aslan's whiskers tickled his ear. Bree shot away like an arrow to the other side of the enclosure. In their turn, the wall was too high for him to jump, and he could fly no farther. Aravis and Hwin both started back, and there was about 1 second of intense silence. Then Hwin, though shaking all over, gave a strange little neigh and trotted over to the lion. Please, she said, you're so beautiful. You may devour me if you like. I'd sooner be eaten by you than even fed by anybody else. Dearest daughter, said Aslan, planting a lion's kiss on her twitching velvet nose, I knew you would not be long in coming to me. Joy shall be yours. Then he lifted his head and he spoke in a louder voice. Now, Bree, he said, you poor, proud, frightened horse, draw near. Nearer still, my son. Do not dare not to dare. Touch me. Smell me. Here are my paws. Here's my tail. These are my whiskers. I am a true beast. Aslan, said Bree in a shaken voice. I'm afraid I must rather be a fool. Aslan responded, happy the horse who knows that while he was still young, or the human either. Aslan shows up. And when Bree knew him, the Lion King in his head, but he didn't know him and how beautiful he really was. And Hwin says, you may devour me if you like. See, the gospel frees you to submit the moment that you look at Jesus and God and say, you may devour me. Take all of me. I'd rather you devour me than be fed by anything else. Hwin got it. The little foal saw the true beauty of Jesus dying for her. She knew this lion was brighter and bigger and more beautiful than she ever had. And until you and I can see that beauty poured out for us on the cross, we will never be able to submit to others. But this morning, if not for the first time, but for the 100th time, see him as beautiful. See him as dying for you and rising again. Go to him and say, you may devour me, for I'd rather that than be fed by anything else. Be devoured in submission. The gospel wants you to do that. Grace begs you. Please pray with me.